In December 1154, one of the most charismatic of all kings of England began his reign. Henry II was a star amongst monarchs whose huge personality and keen intelligence would extend royal power as much by law as by the sword. But, like many stars, Henry was cursed with a turbulent family whose prides and passions would do much to undermine his extraordinary achievements. This is the story of King Henry II and his heirs. Henry II was just 21 years old when he inherited the throne of England. But Henry was only half English. He spoke French, and he was heir to great lands and titles in France. The young Henry was a product of that hybrid Anglo-French culture which had ruled in England since the time of the Norman conquest. He was born here in Anjou, his father's ancestral lands in the heart of France. But if his father were French, his mother was the daughter of the English king, Henry I, and she made sure that the young Henry was familiar with England as well. Between the ages of 10 and 14, he lived at Bristol, where he had an English guardian and an English tutor who gave him his lifelong love of learning. He then returned to France, where he accumulated territories year by year: Normandy, Anjou, and finally Aquitaine, through his marriage to the beautiful Eleanor. But England was the greatest prize of all, fought over for 20 years by Henry's mother Matilda and his cousin Stephen. It now fell into Henry's grasp. Partly because Stephen had no heir, but above all because the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, the barons, saw in Henry a man they had to do business with. But though he was the barons' candidate, Henry quickly showed them who was master. It was a time when God and his angels slept, as the chroniclers lamented, with pardonable exaggeration. Nowadays, such thuggish disorder tends to come from those at the bottom of the social pile. Then it came from the men at the top, known as barons. The barons seized royal castles, and they built new illegal castles of their own. And the hard-won unity of England threatened to disintegrate into a series of baronial statelets, each with its own castle capital. Henry, who had a vigorous sense of royal authority, was determined to stamp on this development. So royal castles, he decreed, must be returned to the king, and illegal castles should be demolished. One man, Hugh Mortimer, the Marcher Lord, dared to resist. Henry took his forces to the Welsh Marches, the seat of Mortimer's power, and he laid siege simultaneously to all three of Mortimer's castles, including this one at Wigmore in Herefordshire. One by one, Mortimer's castles surrendered, until finally, on the 7th of July, 1155, Baron Mortimer himself made a formal submission to the king in front of a specially summoned assembly of bishops, earls, and barons. Henry had given an object lesson in the arts of kingship to his mightiest subjects, and he'd made a spectacularly successful start to his reign. Henry's vision of royal authority extended beyond England to the whole of Britain, over which, like his greatest predecessors, the Anglo-Saxon Edgar and the Norman William the Conqueror, he saw himself as having imperial authority. The King of Scots was driven back behind the old frontiers of his kingdom. In Wales, he made the princes do homage to him, formally acknowledging him as their superior. For 2 decades, England had been weak, but now the crown was worn by a man whose personality matched the pretensions of the position. He overawed and faced down opponents at every turn.
He is a great, indeed the greatest of monarchs, for he has no superior of whom he stands in awe, nor subject who may resist him.
His energy and temper were legendary, and his physical presence mesmerizing.
His face was one upon which a man might gaze 1,000 times and still feel drawn to gaze on again.
Henry's charismatic personality gave him the best of both worlds. He could consult and take advice as an English king was bound to, but he could always be pretty confident of winning the argument. And he could win even when he wasn't there in person, thanks to his innovations in the law, which became a kind of mirror reflecting and multiplying his royal authority. The main writing office was known as the Chancery, and these are typical of the documents that it produced. They're called writs, that is, standardized royal orders. The writ itself is written out on the slip of parchment, and then it's authenticated by attaching the Great Seal. The seal is deliberately large and impressive, and it carried the king's image to the furthest corners of his dominions. And it makes an important point about the nature of kingship. On the front, the king is seated as a lawgiver and judge. On the reverse, he is mounted and armed as the warrior defender of his people. The writ is much less showy than the seal, but its effects were even more far-reaching. For, in the course of Henry's reign, writs were developed to deal with all the most common legal problems of the king's subjects. They were mass-produced by the Chancery clerks, and they were available for a fee to every freeman. Previously, the king's justice had depended on the king's actual presence. Now, with the writ, the seal, and the magic of writing, the king and his justice could be everywhere for everybody. But Henry's was not the only monarchy in England. There was another power in the land. The church was a state within a state. It was also a superstate whose boundaries were even wider than those of Henry's empire. Once the church had been the nursemaid of monarchy, now it threatened to become its master. In the Middle Ages, the power of the church soared over England and all Western Europe. Like the European Union today, whose frontiers it shares, the power of the church reached everywhere, crossing borders, claiming rights, and dispensing its own justice in its own courts. But, unlike the European Union, the church also had its own officials on the ground, the priests, bishops and archbishops, and above all, it had its own very visible head, the Pope in Rome. The Pope, as the successor of St. Peter, claimed the religious allegiance of all Catholic Christians, including kings and emperors. But the Pope was also an elective monarch, the heir of the Roman emperors, who often claimed to be the political superior of kings as well. And kings, however good Christians they were, rarely took that claim lying down. No one was less disposed to lie down than Henry. He thought he'd found the perfect instrument to control the church in Thomas Becket, whom he appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket was a middle-class Londoner whom Henry had plucked from obscurity to make Chancellor, Chief Minister, and his closest personal friend. He expected similar loyalty from his new Archbishop. In vain. From the first, Becket went out of his way to pick a fight with the king. He ostentatiously resigned the chancellorship, and he took an extreme and intransigent stance on any issue, however petty, which affected the church's claim to absolute independence. Why the transformation in Becket from the king's dearest friend to his bitterest enemy? Had he undergone a religious transformation? Was he just a consummate actor, throwing himself with zest into a new part? Was he trying to prove himself to his fellow clergy, many of whom thought him no better than a royal stooge? Any and every of these explanations is possible. What is certain, however, is that Becket's behaviour provoked an equal and opposite reaction in the king. Neither man would give way. One or the other would have to break or to be broken. Henry's first 10 years on the throne had been a glittering success. But now he confronted two major challenges. Who should succeed to Henry's vast empire after his death? And where did ultimate authority lie? With the king or with the church and churchmen? It was the issue of priests who committed crimes like murder and highway robbery, which sparked off the final clash with the church. These thugs in cassocks were tried in church courts, where they received derisory sentences. After the collapse of one such murder trial, Henry demanded that the man be handed over to a royal court. Becket refused. Henry met the challenge head-on, and at a meeting of the council held in the royal palace of Clarendon near Oxford, he tabled a list of what he claimed were the customs of the realm. The customs left the church jurisdiction over matters of faith, but disputes about property or the punishment of clergy who were convicted of crimes like robbery or homicide were to belong in the future to the king's laws. Becket disdained Henry's pseudo-historical arguments. Instead, as usual, he took the high moral ground, basing himself on the words in the Bible, "Touch not mine anointed." But even Becket yielded before Henry's crude threats of force and accepted the constitutions. Soon, however, Becket repudiated his submission on the grounds that it had been extorted under duress, and the dispute between king and archbishop flared up more fiercely than before. And this time, in fear of his life, Becket fled abroad. But Becket's flight only focused attention on the issue of the succession. Henry decided to leave each of his 4 sons a substantial inheritance. In 1169, he announced how his dominions would be divided on his death. His eldest son and principal heir, Henry, would receive England, Normandy, and Anjou. Richard would be Duke of Aquitaine, and Geoffrey would receive Brittany. There was no land as yet for his beloved baby son, John. Henry had an eye on conquering Ireland for him. Henry had 2 reasons for dividing his lands amongst his sons. The first was to placate the King of France, whose kingdom was threatened with extinction by the vastness of Henry's power, whilst the second was to try to keep the peace amongst his teenage sons, who, it was already clear, had inherited his own ferocious temper. But in practice, the division of his lands proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. He had whetted his sons' appetite with the promise of future power, but he'd given them little or nothing in the present, and there was also a risk that the irritated princes and the exiled archbishop might make common cause. For, from his haven in France, Becket continued to defy Henry by making ever more grandiose claims to the independence of the church.
Since it is certain that kings receive their power from the church, so you have not the power. Restore to the Church of Canterbury, from which you received your promotion and coronation, the rank and status it